What's unfolding here isn't just another headline. It's a collision of narratives, timing, and named players that now sit on the same timeline. At the center are Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni, tied through It Ends With Us and Wayfarer Studios, with Ryan Reynolds positioned alongside the broader public response. But what has pulled this story into a different lane is how it now overlaps with media coverage involving Taylor Swift, major outlets like Rolling Stone, and the way criticism itself has been framed and reframed over time. This isn't about declaring who's right or wrong, it's about understanding how context changes meaning. Because when coverage, production roles, and legal developments are viewed separately, they can seem straightforward. But when those same elements are placed on a single timeline, linking public backlash, media narratives, and court-facing realities, the story stops looking simple. What's being examined now isn't a rumor. It's how specific narratives gained traction, how others were dismissed, and how those shifts happened alongside real-world events connected to a major film production, named individuals, and documented actions. That matters because narratives don't exist in a vacuum. They move through media, fan communities, and eventually into spaces where documentation and consistency matter more than perception. And once that transition begins, the rules change. This video isn't here to speculate. It's here to trace how these names, Blake Lively, Justin Baldoni, Ryan Reynolds, Taylor Swift, along with entities like Wayfarer Studios and It Ends With Us, became connected in ways that are now being viewed through a more careful lens, not as a conclusion, but as a sequence. And once that sequence is laid out clearly, the questions that follow become harder to ignore. It didn't start with a filing. It started with how criticism itself was redefined. Before courts, before timelines, and before formal review, there was a shift in framing that quietly altered how the situation was understood in public. Criticism surrounding Blake Lively, particularly connected to It Ends With Us and Wayfarer Studios, had already been circulating. Viewers questioned promotional choices, branding decisions, and the absence of Justin Baldoni from moments where his presence was expected. None of that was new. What changed was how that criticism began to be described. Instead of being treated as organic backlash, portions of it were reframed through media coverage as something else, coordinated, artificial, or driven by inauthentic behavior online. That reframing mattered because it didn't just respond to criticism, it reclassified it. And once that happens, the lens shifts. Major coverage, including discussion tied to Rolling Stone, began to blend separate conversations into a single narrative space. Disapproval aimed at Blake Lively's public conduct was discussed alongside broader claims about online manipulation, with indirect overlaps pulling in names like Taylor Swift and references to fan behavior. The effect wasn't to clarify, it was to compress multiple conversations into one. That compression created a new starting point. Instead of asking why people reacted the way they did, the focus moved to who might be behind the reaction. That subtle pivot redirected attention away from actions and toward intent, without requiring proof. And once intent enters the conversation, scrutiny intensifies. This is where context becomes essential, because the original criticism existed within a very specific environment, a major film adaptation tied to Colleen Hoover, a studio-led production involving Justin Baldoni, and public-facing decisions made by Blake Lively, with Ryan Reynolds present in the background of the response cycle. Those elements didn't disappear, but they were no longer the focus. Instead, the conversation moved toward narrative defense. That shift didn't resolve anything. It changed what people were asked to pay attention to. And when narratives change before records are reviewed, questions tend to follow later, especially once timelines begin to matter. Because once criticism is reclassified, the next question isn't what happened, it's why the framing changed when it did. The moment you reintroduce the production itself, the story stops being abstract. Only once the conversation moved beyond surface-level criticism, something important was often left out: the environment where all of this actually originated. This wasn't a standalone media moment. It was tied to a specific project with defined roles, responsibilities, and creative control. It Ends With Us wasn't just another film. It was a high-profile adaptation of Colleen Hoover's work, produced through Wayfarer Studios, with Justin Baldoni deeply involved on the creative and production side. Blake Lively entered that environment not as a passive participant, but as a central, public-facing figure, while Ryan Reynolds became part of the surrounding response cycle once public attention intensified. That context matters because production environments come with structure. Studios, producers, and creatives don't operate in a vacuum. Decisions around promotion, branding, and public messaging are shaped by contracts, expectations, and internal dynamics. When those decisions are later questioned publicly, they don't exist as isolated choices. They're viewed in relation to who had authority, who had responsibility, and who was expected to be present. This is where the narrative began to stretch. Criticism that initially focused on public-facing behavior was now being discussed alongside ideas about coordination, influence, and motive. But without grounding that discussion in the realities of the production itself, the picture became distorted. Roles blurred, responsibilities overlapped, and clarity gave way to implication. What often gets lost here is that production context explains why scrutiny didn't emerge randomly. Viewers weren't reacting to nothing. They were reacting to perceived gaps between the project, the people involved, and how it was being presented. By removing that context, the conversation shifted away from what the production looked like and toward how the reaction to it should be interpreted. That shift didn't answer questions, it postponed them. And once a situation tied to a named project, a named studio, and named individuals is reframed without that grounding, it creates a vacuum, one where narratives can fill the space faster than records. That's why bringing the production back into view changes everything. It restores the setting where expectations were formed and where inconsistencies become easier to spot once timelines are examined. Because when you place the project back at the center, the next question isn't about reaction, it's whether the sequence of events still holds together once timing is examined. Once timing enters the picture, narratives stop floating, they start getting tested. Up to this point, much of the conversation had been driven by framing and reaction, but when events are placed on a timeline, a different kind of scrutiny begins. Because timelines don't care about intent or perception, they care about order. This is where things become more concrete. Public criticism surrounding Blake Lively intensified during a specific window tied closely to promotional activity for It Ends With Us. Around that same period, media coverage expanded, pulling in broader discussions that touched on online behavior, fan dynamics, and adjacent figures like Taylor Swift. At first glance, these appeared to be parallel conversations, but when aligned chronologically, overlaps emerged. That alignment raised questions, not about coordination, but about sequence, about what was known, what was said, and when certain narratives gained momentum. Because in situations involving named individuals, Justin Baldoni, Ryan Reynolds, studio leadership, and creative stakeholders, the timing of responses can be just as revealing as their content. This is where records begin to matter more than reactions. When statements, interviews, or media pieces are placed alongside production milestones and public events, patterns start to form. Some actions appear reactive, others appear preemptive, and some simply don't line up the way they might have seemed when viewed in isolation. That doesn't mean conclusions can be drawn, but it does mean assumptions get challenged. Timelines also narrow possibilities. They make it harder to attribute outcomes to vague forces because the order of events limits what could realistically have influenced what. If a narrative appears after a moment of backlash, it plays differently than if it appears before. If a response follows criticism closely, it suggests one thing. If it arrives much later, it suggests another. This is why timing becomes a pressure point. For a story involving a major adaptation, a known studio like Wayfarer Studios, and a creator as prominent as Colleen Hoover, timing affects credibility. It shapes how decisions are interpreted once they're reviewed with distance rather than immediacy. And once timelines are laid out clearly, they don't argue, they simply exist, leaving anyone reviewing them to ask whether the sequence still supports the narrative that came first. Because once the timeline is fixed, the next question isn't what people believed at the time, it's what the order of events actually allows to be true. When timelines harden, pressure doesn't arrive loudly, it accumulates. Once the sequence of events becomes clearer, attention naturally shifts to the points where explanations begin to strain. This is where pressure starts to build, not from public reaction, but from comparison. Statements are no longer viewed on their own. They're read alongside other statements, other moments, and other records. That comparison changes everything. As scrutiny increased, the framing around Blake Lively's situation began to rely more heavily on narrative alignment than on specific actions. Media discussions that referenced online behavior and external influence were now being weighed against earlier criticism that focused on tangible choices tied to It Ends With Us and Wayfarer Studios. When those two frames were placed side by side, gaps appeared. Not contradictions in the dramatic sense, but tension. Because explanations that work in isolation don't always hold when placed next to one another. A response framed one way early on can feel incomplete when later context is introduced. And once that happens, each additional explanation adds weight rather than clarity. This is also where roles matter. Justin Baldoni's position as a central creative figure, Blake Lively's role as a public-facing presence, and Ryan Reynolds' visibility during the response cycle all become relevant, not as accusations, but as reference points. They define who was expected to act, respond, or clarify at different moments. Pressure builds when expectations don't line up cleanly with outcomes. What initially appeared as a contained situation now touched multiple layers: production decisions, media framing, public perception, and timing. Each layer brought its own logic, but they didn't always reinforce one another. Instead, they created a stack of explanations that had to coexist. That coexistence is where strain shows up. Because the more layers added, the more difficult it becomes to maintain a single consistent framing. Review, whether by media, observers, or eventually formal systems, doesn't look for intent first, it looks for alignment. And alignment becomes harder as explanations multiply. This doesn't mean the story collapses, but it does mean it enters a different phase. One where narratives are no longer expanding freely, and where each new detail is measured against what's already on record. Because once pressure starts building from comparison, the next issue isn't how loudly the story is told, it's how well each version still fits together under scrutiny. Pressure becomes unavoidable the moment two narratives try to occupy the same space. By this stage, the story is no longer moving in a single direction, it's pulling against itself. On one side is a narrative shaped by public reaction and media framing, on the other is a set of events tied to a real production, real roles, and a real sequence of decisions. When those two paths intersect, friction follows. This is where collision happens. Public discussion continued to frame criticism of Blake Lively through a broader lens, suggesting patterns of online behavior and external influence. At the same time, unresolved questions tied directly to It Ends With Us and Wayfarer Studios remained. Those questions hadn't disappeared, they were simply being discussed less directly. That imbalance matters, because narratives don't replace one another, they compete. And when one narrative attempts to explain away another without addressing it fully, tension grows. Observers begin to notice what's being emphasized and what's being avoided. This is also where adjacent figures remain relevant. Justin Baldoni's creative and production role doesn't vanish just because the conversation shifts. Ryan Reynolds' visibility during moments of response still shapes perception, even when he's not the focus. And references to figures like Taylor Swift, introduced through media overlap and fan discourse, add another layer of complexity, even when no direct action is alleged. These names don't create the pressure, they reveal it, because each represents a different sphere: production, publicity, media, and fandom. When all those spheres touch the same timeline, alignment becomes harder to maintain. Statements meant for one audience are now read by another. Explanations intended to calm one conversation spill into a different one entirely. That spillover changes how everything is interpreted. What once felt like separate issues now look connected, not because someone forced the connection, but because the same events keep appearing in multiple contexts. And once that happens, narratives stop moving independently. They start colliding. This doesn't automatically resolve anything, but it does narrow options. Because once narratives overlap, each one has to account for the other. Silence becomes noticeable, clarifications become riskier, and the space for ambiguity begins to shrink. Because when narratives collide, the next question isn't which one is louder, it's which one still holds together when both are examined at once. Once narratives collide, attention stops drifting and starts settling on process. At this point, the story begins to move away from interpretation and towards structure. When multiple narratives compete, the only way to make sense of them is to look at how decisions are actually reviewed, not emotionally, not socially, but procedurally. This is where the lens changes. Instead of asking which explanation feels more convincing, the focus turns to what can be evaluated consistently. That means records, timelines, roles, and how each element fits within established systems. In situations tied to a major production like It Ends With Us, that shift matters because creative projects operate within formal frameworks, contracts, employment classifications, and defined chains of responsibility. This is where Justin Baldoni's role as a producer and creative lead becomes structurally relevant, not narratively. It's also where Blake Lively's public-facing position is examined in relation to expectations rather than perception, and where Ryan Reynolds' involvement, however indirect, is viewed through proximity and timing rather than intention. Process doesn't ask why first, it asks how. How decisions were made, how responses were timed, how roles were defined at each stage. When media narratives are filtered through that lens, much of the noise falls away. What remains are questions that can be tested against documentation. Did actions align with stated roles? Did timelines support the explanations offered? Did the sequence of events make sense once placed in order? This doesn't imply fault, it implies examination. And examination changes behavior. As scrutiny becomes more procedural, the room for broad framing narrows. Statements are expected to match records, context must align with documented responsibility, and explanations that relied on implication are replaced by ones that have to stand on their own. This is often where momentum slows, not because interest fades, but because standards rise. Once the process takes over, the story is no longer shaped by who controls the narrative. It's shaped by what can be verified. And verification doesn't respond to urgency, it responds to clarity. Because once the process becomes the focus, the next question isn't how the story is told, it's whether the structure underneath it can support the claims being made. You can tell when pressure is real by what stops being said. Once process takes over, something subtle begins to happen. The story doesn't explode, it contracts. Language tightens, messaging becomes more careful, and strategies that once relied on broad framing start to narrow without announcement. This is not accidental. When scrutiny moves from public reaction to procedural review, every statement has to anticipate comparison, not just with other statements, but with records, timelines, and defined roles. In that environment, saying less can feel safer than saying more. This is where strategy shifts. What once looked like an effort to control narrative momentum begins to look more like an effort to avoid misalignment. Explanations that previously emphasized interpretation are replaced with statements that emphasize position, not what something meant, but where someone stood. That distinction matters. In a situation involving Blake Lively, Justin Baldoni, and a named production like It Ends With Us, silence or restraint doesn't signal resolution, it signals recalibration. Each party has to consider how any new statement will sit beside what's already on record, because once something is written, it doesn't fade, it accumulates. This is also where comparisons intensify. Observers begin noticing what has changed in tone, what is no longer emphasized, and which details are now treated more cautiously. That doesn't mean intent has shifted, but it does mean awareness has. The cost of inconsistency becomes clearer, and once that cost is understood, strategies adapt. This phase often feels quieter to the outside world, fewer sweeping claims, less expansive framing, but internally it's one of the most consequential moments, because the range of acceptable explanations narrows and the margin for error shrinks. What remains is a careful balancing act, maintaining coherence across narratives, roles, and timelines without introducing new tension. That's not easy, especially when multiple audiences are still watching. And when strategy becomes cautious rather than expansive, it's usually because the story is no longer being shaped freely, it's being measured. Because when strategy tightens under review, the next issue isn't what's said next, it's what can no longer be said without creating new problems. The loudest version of a story is rarely the one that matters most. By this stage, a clear divide has formed. On one side is the public conversation, fast-moving, reactive, and shaped by interpretation. On the other is formal review, slow, deliberate, and anchored to records. The difference between those two spaces is where many misunderstandings begin. Public narratives thrive on immediacy. They reward clarity, even when clarity comes from simplification. In this case, discussions around Blake Lively, Justin Baldoni, and It Ends With Us continued to circulate across media and fan communities, often blending reaction with assumption. Names like Taylor Swift appeared in that conversation not because of direct action, but because of overlap in media coverage and audience attention. Formal review doesn't work that way. When events are evaluated through structured systems, whether legal, contractual, or procedural, the emphasis shifts away from reaction and toward verification. What matters isn't how a narrative spread, but whether it aligns with documented roles, timelines, and responsibilities. Influence is not assumed, it has to be shown. This is where many public interpretations begin to lose traction. A claim that feels persuasive online may carry little weight if it can't be tied to a specific action. A reaction that seems widespread may matter less than a single documented decision, and narratives that depend on implication often dissolve when placed alongside records that demand precision. That contrast can be uncomfortable. It explains why stories that feel settled in the public space can still appear unresolved or even fragile when examined formally. The standards are different, the questions are narrower, and the tolerance for ambiguity is much lower. For a situation involving a major studio like Wayfarer Studios, a high-profile adaptation connected to Colleen Hoover, and individuals with clearly defined roles, that difference becomes critical. The same facts are being processed in two entirely different systems at the same time, and those systems don't talk to each other. This is why momentum in one space doesn't guarantee momentum in the other. Public certainty doesn't translate into procedural confidence, and clarity in headlines doesn't equal clarity in review. Because when public narratives and formal review move in opposite directions, the next question isn't which one dominates the conversation, it's which one ultimately determines what remains on record. When a story slows down, it doesn't mean it's fading, it means it's narrowing. At this point, much of the noise has already fallen away. What remains is a more limited set of questions that haven't been resolved, not because they're dramatic, but because they require careful review. This is the phase where outcomes feel closer, even though nothing has been finalized. The situation involving Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni, tied to It Ends With Us and Wayfarer Studios, now exists in this narrowed space. Public attention may have moved on to newer developments, but the underlying issues haven't disappeared. They've simply shifted into a slower, more controlled process. That shift changes expectations. Instead of new narratives emerging daily, progress now depends on alignment between statements, roles, and documented actions. Each remaining question is evaluated not in isolation, but in relation to everything that came before it. That makes forward movement deliberate rather than fast. This is also where speculation loses relevance. What matters now isn't what could have happened, but what can be shown to have happened. Timing, responsibility, and consistency become the primary lenses, and those lenses don't widen, they focus. For figures like Ryan Reynolds, whose presence has been part of the broader discussion, relevance is no longer about visibility, it's about proximity to events as they appear on the record. For Taylor Swift, whose name surfaced through media overlap rather than direct involvement, relevance remains contextual, not central. That distinction is important. It keeps the conversation grounded in what is actually under review rather than what is merely adjacent. As the scope narrows, the number of viable interpretations shrinks as well. The process becomes less about storytelling and more about sufficiency. Where things stand now isn't dramatic, it's precise. The questions still on the table are quieter than the headlines that preceded them, but they carry more weight. And until those questions are addressed within the framework that governs them, the story remains open, just not open-ended. Because when only a few questions remain, the final issue isn't how loud the debate once was, it's whether the remaining details can withstand close examination. Even when a story narrows this far, resolution doesn't arrive on a schedule. At this stage, it's tempting to assume the outcome is already set. The conversation has slowed, new narratives aren't forming, and the story no longer dominates headlines the way it once did. But that quiet doesn't signal an ending, it signals a pause shaped by process. Because what remains unresolved here isn't noise, it's structure. The situation involving Blake Lively, Justin Baldoni, and the production ecosystem around It Ends With Us and Wayfarer Studios now lives almost entirely within formal evaluation. That means attention is focused on what's documented, what's consistent, and what can be reconciled across timelines and roles. This is where closure becomes difficult to predict. Processes that rely on records don't move quickly, but they also don't forget. Statements made earlier remain fixed. Decisions tied to specific moments don't change with perception. And once something is preserved in writing, it carries forward, regardless of how the conversation outside evolves. That's why this phase matters more than it appears. Even without new public developments, the framework that governs what happens next is already in place. It doesn't respond to momentum or popularity. It responds to alignment. And alignment is something that can only be assessed once all the pieces are laid out together. For those watching from the outside, this can feel unsatisfying. There's no clear signal to react to, no definitive shift to point at. But inside structured systems, this is often the most consequential moment, when the story stops expanding and starts being measured. What ultimately remains on record will shape how this situation is understood later, not how loudly it was debated in the moment. And that understanding won't be formed by speculation, but by what holds up when everything else has fallen away. That's why this still isn't over. Not because something new is coming, but because what already exists hasn't finished being evaluated. Because when a story reaches this point, the real ending isn't decided by attention, it's decided by what remains once scrutiny is complete. What this situation ultimately shows is how differently stories behave once they leave the public space and enter a formal one. Online, narratives move fast, attention shifts, reactions stack on top of each other. But once a situation involving named individuals like Blake Lively, Justin Baldoni, Ryan Reynolds, and a defined production ecosystem such as It Ends With Us and Wayfarer Studios reaches structured review, the pace changes completely. Nothing disappears, nothing resets. Records remain exactly as they were when they were created. Timelines don't adjust to perception, and explanations don't gain strength just because they were repeated often. That's the part that's easy to miss. This story isn't being shaped anymore by who controls the conversation. It's being shaped by what holds together when everything is placed side by side: roles, timing, actions, and documentation. And that kind of evaluation doesn't produce instant conclusions. It produces quiet outcomes. What remains after that process won't look dramatic. It won't arrive with a headline, but it will last longer than any moment of attention ever could. And that's why following the structure matters more than following the noise. If this breakdown helped clarify how this situation is unfolding, you can support the channel by liking the video and subscribing for future analysis. New developments will be covered the same way, carefully, context first, and grounded in what actually remains on record. Thanks for watching.